Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today we are talking to Ariane Tabatabai, an associate political scientist at RAND, also the author with Dina Esfandiari of Triple Axis, a book about Iran's relationship with Russia and China, and the recent author with Colin Clark of a piece for FPRI entitled Iran Seeks to Cement Legitimacy of Shia Militias. I thought today's conversation would be a good bookend to the conversation we had 2 weeks ago with Afshan Astavar about the American-Iranian tensions in the Persian Gulf. So welcome to the show, Ariane.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
So it's great to have you on because, as I was reading your piece for FPRI, I was struck by what I assumed was your section in the piece, just knowing what you and Colin do, about this idea of Iranian proxies and the fact that it predates the Islamic Republic and how it actually goes back to the Shah's time.
Yeah, I think it's an underappreciated part of the history of Iran's relationship with proxies in the region. Iran actually started to work with different Shia groups in Lebanon and Iraq, the Kurds as well there. Before the revolution, the Shah was obviously trying to expand his country's influence in the region. He always believed that that Iran was sort of owed this historical, hegemony due to its history, due to the amount of resources and population and geostrategic location. And the natural way for Iran to build these ties, given that it is in a bit of a minority, not being an Arab country, not being majority Sunni, it found itself struggling a little bit to build the same level of ties with its neighbors on a state level. And so it started to look instead toward groups, ethnic groups, religious groups that would share some of the same identities that different Iranian groups have, and Kurds and Shias in particular were a natural target for Iran at the time. And then, of course, after 1979, when the revolutionaries toppled the Shah, they vowed immediately to kind of get rid of all of the Shah's foreign policy. But they ended up repeating some of the same patterns. And one of the things that they actually took and decided to build on was this idea of building ties with various proxy groups across the region. And that fit really nicely into the narrative that Khomeini and others had about wanting to export the revolution, trying to stand up for Shia communities across the region.
Yeah, and I think, for the U.S., before the Iraq invasion, the primary concern about Iranian proxies, if I have it right, was probably Hezbollah because of its relationship with Israel. And I think that you guys called it sort of like the main vanguard, I'm paraphrasing from your piece, of Iranian proxy foreign policy.
Yeah, that's right. Hezbollah is the poster child of Iran's proxies, right? In that it sits on top. It's one of the longest relationships. It was built upon the foundations that the Shah had laid out, and immediately after the revolution, and even during the Iran-Iraq War, which was the biggest existential crisis that had faced the country in a long time, the Iranians decided to send some troops to Lebanon to support the Shias there. That means that they saw Lebanon as a really important theater for themselves, and they saw their ties with the Shia groups there as incredibly important. And then, of course, they facilitated, they helped Hezbollah as it was established, and have since really developed a relationship that is unparalleled by other groups. Nasrallah is one of the only proxy leaders that goes to Tehran and meets with the highest levels of the Iranian government, and that the Iranian government then publicizes. So there are numerous photos of him meeting with Khamenei, for example, which is not something you would normally see. They typically, the Iranians try to keep these relationships a bit more covert. for various reasons that we can get into. But with Hezbollah, things have been a little different. And the level of support that Iran gives to Hezbollah is also very different from what it gives to other groups. There's funding there, there is training, equipment, intel sharing, and Hezbollah has now become this sort of facilitator, this mediator between Iran and other groups as well. So just to give you a quick example, in the past few years, Hezbollah has served as a go-between Iran and the Houthis in Yemen.
Yeah, no, that's where I wanted to go. Because I think it's important because one element of the tensions with the United States right now has to do with the proxy, or like the Shia militia groups in Iraq with ties to Iran, and they're it ultimately comes down to it's more covert than overt. And I was wondering if you can get into that dynamic, because there's something similar with the Houthis in that, like, it's not nearly as overt as Nasrallah going to Tehran, as you just mentioned.
Yeah, in fact, for a long time, Iranian officials denied that they had anything to do with the Houthis, right? They talked about the Houthis have their own legitimate grievances, but they didn't really get into the fact that they were supporting the Houthis. That's changed to a certain degree over the past few years, and it's largely been facilitated by the Yemen war, where the Iranians have increasingly seen the Houthis as being, a low-cost way, support for the Houthis being a low-cost way for them to really exacerbate the Saudis and to bug them down in Yemen and to put a lot of pressure on them, drive a wedge between Riyadh and Washington. So as the conflict has dragged on, we've also seen an uptick in support coming from Iran toward the Houthis. In Iraq, things are a bit different. Again, all of these groups are very different, and their relationships are very different with Iran. But the Shia militias, obviously not being monolithic, they also have different groups that have different relationships with Iran. But for many of them, Iran had been careful not to be too overt about its relationships either, though it has, since the beginning of the Iraq War, so in 2003, the Iranians have really leveraged those connections to target Americans in Iraq, and to try to partially to deter them in Iraq, partially to bug the U.S. down, and raise the cost of involvement in Iraq as well.
Yeah, and like this is sort of led within the U.S. side to, and I guess probably on the Iranian side, maybe you can talk about it a little bit from both sides, is the elevation of Qasem Soleimani, who's the head of the IRGC, who seems to be the interlocutor or the go-between for the Iranian political and military elite. So I guess he is the military elite. Who is able to be the conduit through which that they talk to these different groups, whether it be in Yemen and in Iraq. And that's quite almost advantageous position for Iran to be in, because it has this plausible deniability if it ever wants to ratchet up tensions with the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, plausible deniability is a big reason why Iran uses proxies, right? Iran, to be clear, doesn't have the conventional capabilities that the United States and some of its partners have in the region. And so the way it has been able to make up for and compete with its adversaries, again, particularly the United States, has been through asymmetric forces, by operating in the gray zone. And a big pillar of that is the use of these proxy groups. And Soleimani is the guy that has really cultivated this network of proxies. So there's a new CSIS report, I guess it's not that new anymore, but from a couple of months ago, where they estimated that Iran's proxies are at about 200,000, a bit less than that, 190,000 forces currently. So that's a significant network that they have there. And Soleimani has leveraged his personal relationships, his knowledge of these different countries, his personality to build these ties across the region. He's an interesting character because, he's often been called the shadow commander, right? If you remember, there was this New Yorker piece a few years ago that talked about the shadow commander, and it's picked up quite a bit.
Yeah, but he's really not that. Space.
That's right, but he's not that shadowy anymore. I mean, he's all over the map, right? He has social media accounts that follow him and publicize his photos in Iraq and Syria. There is not a single month where you don't have a new profile of him coming up. but he's become this sort of, we see him as this almighty character in Iran that is the mastermind of Iranian foreign policy and security policies. And I think that's not exactly accurate. But what has been interesting is that since the rise of ISIS, he's gained, it seems, popularity in Iran. He's become a lot more forthcoming in his public appearances. And there too, there are different reports about whether or not he likes the attention and the spotlight or not. But overall, he's become a lot more forthcoming. Something that is interesting to me about Soleimani is that even though we tend to associate him with some of the most challenging aspects of Iran's foreign policy, on some domestic issues, he's pretty moderate, and he's actually been known to try to moderate certain positions within the regime. So he's an interesting character in that sense. He's pretty multi-layered, and he's certainly been able to build this network and to execute Iranian foreign policy in the region over the past few years.
Can you actually talk about what things he wants to moderate? I'm genuinely curious.
So just a couple of examples. One is domestic politics that I actually really enjoy as an interesting kind of window into Soleimani's views. A few years ago, he gave this speech where, he was talking about opposition, dissent within the country. And people, I think, had asked him, what he thought about the hijab, the mandatory veil that women have to wear in the country. And he said something along the lines of, why are we bothering with enforcing these things within the country? Why are we trying to drive a wedge between different factions within the country? And he gave this example of a father and said, as a father, you love your children, whether they're atheists or actually he didn't say atheists, but believers and non-believers, whether they wear the hijab or don't wear the hijab. And, as the leaders of the country, we should be doing the same thing, and we should have the same kind of outlook toward our people. So it's a bit of a patronizing way of looking at it. But it was interesting that you would expect the IRGC commander to kind of come down on the side of, obviously we have to implement Islamic law to the extent possible, but he seemed to have a bit of a different position on that. And then in terms of foreign policy in Yemen, he was one of the people in Iran who believed that the Houthis shouldn't take over Sana'a in 2014, 2015, that this was not the right decision. And so he's held positions that have been more moderate than what we tend to think of with him.
Okay, so if you sort of juxtapose that, because I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that he's basically been given elements of the security portfolio to try and respond to things, that the United States has done since the Trump administration has come into power. And so here that I'm thinking, if you were to widen the aperture a little bit, is the U.S. withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal, whatever you think about that policy choice, and then began to reinstitute secondary sanctions on energy exports, and has really had quote unquote success in decreasing the amount of oil Iran has been able to export. It's the chief driver of its economy, then that subsidizes so much of its national budget. But at the same time, the United States and the Iranians share the battle space, if you will, in Iraq, and so they have to manage this tense relationship. And I think that some of the concerns coming out of the U.S. is that in response to these actions, or perhaps provocatively, depending on who you talk to, the Iranians are exploring asymmetric ways to put pressure on the U.S., and that's driving a lot of the tensions at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess the biggest challenge for me right now, in the situation that we have, is that, as you said, the Iran and the U.S. are sharing battle space, not just in Iraq, actually, right? In Syria, still, in Afghanistan, and to some degree in Yemen, though you don't have Iranian forces there, and the U.S. is sort of indirectly involved. But at least in three theaters, they're very much involved, and they see these three theaters as pretty important in the region. So the concern there is miscalculation and how the different priorities align. I think that if you look at the three theaters, for Iran, Afghanistan and Afghan stability is still incredibly important, because if Afghanistan goes down and you have a new flow of refugees, for example, if you have instability there, it directly affects Iran. And so we've seen in the past where Iran has been very careful not to do anything escalatory in Afghanistan. It's been a lot more reluctant to take action there. In Iraq, it has more room for maneuver, largely because Iran can actually deal with some level of managed chaos. It prefers some level of managed chaos in Iraq, because if that doesn't exist, then it loses a lot of its influence there, right? And so having the ability to have U.S. forces there in close proxy where it can target them is actually an opportunity for it rather than the opposite. So the way I see the Iranian view of what's going on in Iraq right now is that they don't want the United States to withdraw entirely, because then they lose those targeting opportunities. They want the U.S. to stay. They want to undermine the United States, but they want a minimized level of presence there. So I think that the different theaters are fairly different, but certainly in Iraq, I think that's where we're going to see a lot of the action. We're already seeing a lot of the action between the U.S. and Iran.
I mean, but clearly, I mean, I'd have to assume that they don't want to ever push the U.S. so far as to invite, what we would call small scale retaliatory measures, perhaps, airstrikes, cruise missiles, but on the receiving end would seem a lot bigger than small. I mean, do you see, like, within Iran's proxy strategy, some inherent limits placed upon how much escalation they're willing to tolerate, particularly now? Or, I mean, could we end up in a position back, say, like in 2006, where Iran was comfortable enough, using proxies to kill American soldiers? I mean, I think that is, like, honestly, the two bookend points, the ISIS war and then the 2006 level where you can kill Americans or tolerate Americans. I mean, where do you think that they want to end up in the middle of this spectrum?
Well, I think it's not realistic to expect us to go back to 2014 because, unless ISIS, or you're not going to like this, but ISIS 2.0 emerges, right?
Not allowed to say that, but yes, I get you. A resurgent ISIS insurgency.
Exactly. So some sort of terrorist group that is perceived, or adversary that is perceived by both sides as being equally threatening. ISIS was exactly that. It was the one sort of factor that brought the U.S. and Iran on the same side, not officially, right? But they were both essentially fighting to push back ISIS. And again, there was nuances there, but largely they were on the same side. And so in that period, we saw that there was a reluctance from Iran to target the United States because the USA, from their perspective, was doing part of the job, a big part of the job of pushing back ISIS. And B, Iran had to focus all of its effort on ISIS because that was the major threat to them. Now things are changing, and we're going back to a period, in my view, of competition between the two countries in Iraq, because ISIS is, largely diminished, at least in terms of territorial control and so on. And so the Iranians are once again seeing themselves they're increasingly seeing themselves as being on the opposite side from the United States. And then, of course, there's everything you're just mentioning now, right? The withdrawal from the nuclear deal, the reimposition of sanctions, the escalation that we've seen over the past few weeks. So all of that is putting us, in my view, back to a mid to late 2000s kind of place where we may very well start to see more of these attacks by proxies on U.S. forces and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of limitations, one of the things that I think is not always appreciated is that and I hate the term proxy, right? I wish we didn't talk about proxies, but it's just the easiest sort of shorthand way of referring to these groups. Actually, Afshan, I think, has largely been using non-state clients, which I think is a good way of putting it. I like non-state partners as well. But for our purposes, the thing with the proxies is that they don't all have the same level of reliance on Iran, and you don't have the same level of command and control from all of them, from Iran to all of them. And so one of the challenges that Iran faces is that these groups are not always going to do what Iran wants them to do. And they have their own interests, they have their own agendas. And at times, very often, in some cases, they align with the Iranian objectives and goals, but sometimes they may not. And so Iran may very well end up in a situation where it gets dragged into something that it doesn't want to end up in. And I think the 2014, 2015, again, Houthi takeover of Sana'a is a good one, where the Iranians were really not that excited about that prospect. They didn't think that was a smart decision, but then they ended up having to deal with it. And so, that was, it ended up turning pretty well for the Iranians. But if there is a situation in which one of the proxies provokes the U.S. and there is some sort of response, then the Iranians would be in a pretty tough place. And I exactly share your view that they want to do everything they can below the threshold of overt conflict, whatever the scale of that may be. They really do not want any kind of attack on Iranian facilities, on the Iranian territory itself.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Like the final question here is, so I guess embedded within this, is there some logic to the Trump administration's response to signal that even if a non-state client or a non-state partner were to take action directly against an American, that there would be a response? Is not an effective way to try and deter such action. But in doing so, I always think that makes life easier for Iran. I mean, not easier. It gives Iran opportunities to I always say, tickle the underbelly of American alliances. It's much easier to rocket Riyadh and harass the Emirates because what American president will go to war for them, and so Iran has lots of opportunities to conduct an aggressive foreign policy.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the reason why I think we're now seeing increasingly an effort to, and again, I don't know to what degree the Iranians know and give green lights to the Houthis for these drone attacks and so on. There must be some level of knowledge, but I don't actually know the details. But it seems to me that is part of the reason why they're quite happy to watch that happen, right? Because as you said, what American president is going to go to war for the Saudis or for the Emiratis? And increasingly so now. And part of the reason why I think the Iranians have really benefited from the Yemen war is that it has actually, not that I think we were ever going to go to war to retaliate for Iranian attacks or proxy attacks on the Saudis, but I think it's even a lower prospect now, given the level of the gap that exists between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia on the one hand, and then the different branches of government within the United States about where we should sit when it comes to the Saudis.
Yeah, and really, just final question here. I mean, where is this going? I mean, I think any sane person would like to see a de-escalation between the U.S. and Iranians, because the idea of conflict is not something that would be advisable to either side. But clearly there are grievances, and clearly, the Iranians sending ballistic missiles to the Houthis to fire at Riyadh, certainly credible allegations of Houthi drone attacks on airports in the Emirates, and they sort of still very gray potential, Iranian-backed or Iranian-supported operation in Fujairah. This isn't a good place to be. This is inherently destabilizing. So, is there a pathway back to like unstable stability? Similar to 2014.
I don't know. I do think that, as you said, neither side wants to end up in a conflict. But the challenge here is that I think both sides are banking on the fact that the other side doesn't want conflict. And so both sides are sort of pushing the envelope with the idea that, they're escalating to de-escalate, essentially, right? At what point does escalation just keep escalating, and at what point do you not manage to just de-escalate? So there is that challenge there. My concern is that right now I don't see a path forward really, unless you manage to get the two sides to come back to the negotiating table. Now, the positive thing is that the Trump administration over the past 3 weeks, I think, has done a lot more to signal to the Iranians that it is interested in negotiations. The president himself, a few days ago, if you remember, mentioned something along the lines of, they should just give me a call. I'll pass on my number. And, there was a lot that was made of it, and it became a bit of a meme on social media. But it was, to his credit, one of the first times where he said, come back to the negotiating table. And I'm not just talking about sanctions. We're talking about helping you with your economy. So a broader promise than what had been done in the past. The problem, of course, being that was a step forward, and then we've taken like 5 steps back since, through various statements and through some of the actions that we've seen. But I do think that right now, at least for the next year and a half, until our elections, what we're going to see is the continuation of this, and we just have to hope that there is no miscalculation that leads us into some sort of small conflict. After that, I think the Iranians may actually come back to the negotiating table, and at that point, we may have a chance at sort of addressing the bigger grievances, right, as opposed to just one area. But it's all very dependent on domestic politics on both sides, which are essentially equally unpredictable at this stage, and what happens in the interim, whether or not there is, this status quo continues for another year and a half, or if we end up having some sort of crisis that emerges, actual crisis that emerges in the process.
Well, I think with that, thank you for coming on to the show, and let's together hope for no miscalculations and a pathway back to a telephone call.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
My pleasure. And thanks everybody for listening.